In small towns like Henrietta, Oklahoma, life often moves at a slower pace. There are no constant flashes of media attention, no major crime waves. It's a place where the biggest excitement might come from a local football game or a neighbor's barbecue. But in the spring of 2023, the serenity of this quiet town was shattered by an act of violence that would change everything. It started like any other morning. The McFadden family, living on a quiet street, was just one of many families in Henrietta. Holly McFadden, a 35-year-old woman with two children from a previous marriage, seemed to have found peace. She had married Jesse McFadden, a man with a troubling past but a promising future, or so it seemed. Holly had always sought stability, a sense of belonging that had eluded her before. But that morning, as the sun began to rise over the small town, something was wrong. Holly was gone. Her husband, Jesse McFadden, was nowhere to be found. Their house, usually a refuge from the world outside, was eerily silent. The children, her son Michael, her daughter Tiffany, and two other teens staying over, were also missing. As the day wore on, the disappearance was noted, but at first no one thought much of it. People go missing all the time, especially in a world where people come and go without a word. But the moment the police arrived at the McFadden house, they understood that something was terribly wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, no windows smashed, no doors broken down. But the house was not untouched. It was as if someone had carefully arranged things, perhaps trying to create the illusion of a normal household. Yet, it was not normal. The absence of struggle, no overturned furniture, no chaotic signs of a fight, only deepened the mystery. What started as a missing persons case would soon spiral into something far darker. The moment police opened the door to the McFadden home, they knew they were walking into a scene they would never forget. 7 bodies, a mother, her children, and 2 additional teenage victims, all shot at close range. The cause of death was clear, execution-style killings. But the lack of visible struggle left them with one haunting question: who did this and why? As investigators combed through the crime scene, they found that the bodies were arranged with chilling precision. Jesse McFadden was missing, but his presence loomed over every corner of the house. No signs of violence between him and Holly, no evidence to suggest that they fought. Instead, it was as though the violence had come from someone Holly trusted. The familiarity of the home, the lack of signs of a struggle, pointed to one thing. This had to be someone the victims knew, someone they let inside. The next step was clear: find McFadden. Detective Sarah Hunter was the first to be called to the scene. A seasoned investigator with years of experience, she quickly noted the unsettling calm in the house. Everything appeared in its place, yet there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. The first breakthrough came when investigators found Holly's phone, left behind, seemingly abandoned in the house. They analyzed the last few messages sent from Holly's phone. They were from just the day before. Normal messages, mundane updates about groceries and school events. But the final messages left an ominous feeling. They were from Holly's children, and one read, "Mom said we can't go anywhere for a while. She's scared." Holly was scared. But of what? Was it Jesse McFadden or something else? The investigators knew that to understand the crime, they had to dig deeper into McFadden's past. His history as a convicted sex offender, sentenced to 17 years for the rape of a young woman, had been conveniently buried in the public's memory. Released early from prison, McFadden had been living a quiet life with Holly and her children. He had been given a second chance, but his dark past was never truly behind him. The police found records of his parole conditions and noted the limited supervision he was under. Jesse McFadden had a criminal past, a violent one. Holly had trusted him, and it seemed the community had turned a blind eye. The case took an even darker turn as investigators began uncovering more about his relationship with Holly. People who had once praised McFadden for being a reformed man began to recall troubling interactions. McFadden's obsession with control over Holly's life, his manipulative behavior, and growing anger issues were starting to surface. A chilling realization settled in. This was a man who had never truly been rehabilitated. While police pieced together McFadden's criminal history, they also began interviewing family and friends. They learned that Holly had been increasingly worried in the days before the murders. Her family noticed the tension in her relationship with Jesse, but no one could have predicted what would unfold. A few disturbing phone calls from Holly in the days before her death revealed that she was afraid of Jesse, but no one could figure out why. She had been trying to escape the hold he had on her, but it was too late. As the investigation deepened, the forensic evidence began to speak louder than words. It became clear that McFadden had meticulously planned the murders. He had ensured that there was no evidence of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, almost as though he had orchestrated a perfect execution. The lack of self-defense from his victims, especially the children, pointed to the fact that they knew their killer. He had been inside their home many times before, probably as part of the family. But how could someone so close, someone they trusted, be capable of such horror? At this stage of the investigation, the hunt for Jesse McFadden was intensifying. Police were convinced he was involved, but there was no clear evidence yet. They searched for clues, his whereabouts, his last known communications. The search for McFadden would soon lead them to shocking conclusions. And the truth about what happened inside the McFadden home that fateful night would become more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The next chapter would reveal the first of many startling forensic discoveries. It would begin to unravel the twisted psychology of the man behind these killings and bring investigators closer to uncovering the true motive for this unspeakable act. What they would find next would leave no question about who was responsible, but the question would remain, why? The McFadden home was a place where everyday life once unfolded with a sense of peace, but behind closed doors things were never quite as they appeared. As investigators began to piece together the family's tragic last moments, they discovered a troubling history, one that had been buried beneath a seemingly normal exterior. Jesse McFadden, a man with a criminal past, had managed to hide his darker nature from the public eye, but the truth was about to surface. Holly McFadden had met Jesse years ago. At first, he had appeared charming, attentive, and caring. They were a perfect match, or so Holly believed. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, Michael and Tiffany, and they seemed to blend seamlessly into the new life she had created with Jesse. To outsiders, it was just another quiet suburban family, living in a modest home in Henrietta. But Holly's family had always been suspicious of Jesse. They had been vocal about their concerns, especially after his criminal record came to light. Holly, however, saw in Jesse the opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to build a life free from the turmoil of her past. The truth, however, was much darker. Jesse McFadden had served time for sexual assault. A violent man with a history of manipulative behavior, he had been convicted of raping a young woman in 2003 and had spent 17 years in prison before being released. His actions behind bars didn't go unnoticed either. He had been accused of sending inappropriate messages to a teenage girl while still incarcerated. Despite his criminal background, McFadden was released early and placed on parole, with minimal oversight. He was supposed to be monitored, but the system failed to keep him in check. His release was a ticking time bomb, one that Holly, her children, and the rest of the community had no way of knowing would explode. As investigators dug deeper into McFadden's past, they uncovered a series of troubling signs that had been ignored. People who had interacted with him on a daily basis described him as a man who could charm anyone into believing his reformation, but it didn't take long for those close to him to realize that his temper was always just below the surface. Friends and acquaintances of Holly revealed that she had been increasingly distant in the months leading up to the murders. There were reports of arguments between the couple, some of which had been witnessed by neighbors. Holly had tried to keep a brave face, but it was clear she was struggling. In the weeks before the murders, Holly had begun to withdraw from her friends and family. She confided in her sister about her growing concerns, particularly about Jesse's unpredictable behavior, but Holly never followed through on the warnings. She had hoped things would get better, that Jesse would change, or that she could fix what was broken. It wasn't long before the police learned that McFadden's violent tendencies had escalated, and he had begun making threats. One of his former acquaintances reported that McFadden had openly stated that he couldn't go back to prison, that he would do anything to avoid being locked up again. As investigators sifted through evidence, they started to understand the terrifying reality that Holly had lived in. Jesse had worked hard to create an image of a man who was trying to leave his past behind, but behind that facade was a man who had never really changed. Holly's tragic mistake had been believing in the person he pretended to be. With this newfound knowledge, investigators turned their attention to the home itself. They combed through every inch of the property, looking for any sign of struggle, any clue that might reveal the true sequence of events. The lack of forced entry was puzzling. There were no broken windows or signs that anyone had tried to break in. The front door had been unlocked. The house was too calm, too methodical. But as they dug deeper, they found something unsettling. Holly's phone. It had been left behind, untouched. The last few messages that Holly sent were seemingly ordinary. The messages were to friends and family, arranging plans, talking about the kids, and handling the mundane details of daily life. But one message stood out. It was sent just a few hours before her death, and it was addressed to her daughter Tiffany. It read, "I'm scared. We can't leave right now. I don't want him to hurt you." The message raised more questions than answers. Who was Holly afraid of? Was she referring to Jesse? Or was there something else she knew that no one else did? The police immediately began to suspect that Jesse McFadden was involved, but they had no physical evidence linking him to the murders. He had vanished without a trace, and his whereabouts were unknown. The search for him intensified. Forensic experts began examining the crime scene in more detail, looking for any clues that could reveal what had happened in the hours before the killings. The bodies of Holly and her children, as well as the two teens, had been found in the house. Each victim had been shot at close range, and the lack of defensive wounds indicated that they knew their attacker. The question that remained was, why did this happen? Was it a crime of passion, a premeditated act, or something else entirely? As the investigation continued, the team began to realize that McFadden had planned the murders with chilling precision. The lack of violence between him and Holly suggested that he had killed her without a struggle. The children, who had no way of defending themselves, were executed without mercy. The two missing teens, who had stayed with the family the night before, had been murdered as well, leaving only one explanation. McFadden had wiped out an entire family. But why? The forensic evidence was piling up, and with each new discovery, the case grew even darker. A witness who lived nearby reported seeing McFadden's vehicle parked outside the house at odd hours. His behavior had been erratic in the days leading up to the murders, but no one had connected the dots. The investigation had only just begun, and the deeper the team dug into McFadden's past, the more they realized that this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a carefully executed plan by a man who had always been dangerous, but had hidden it well. As the chapter ended, the investigation was far from over. The police had yet to find McFadden, and the search for him was in full force. The unsettling thought that McFadden might be planning his next move haunted the investigators. But one thing was clear. The calm facade of the McFadden family was nothing but a carefully constructed lie. And the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. By the third day of the investigation, Henrietta's quiet streets felt different. The crime scene tape around the McFadden property no longer drew crowds. It stood as a silent marker of unresolved questions. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, had assumed control, and their forensic team began an exhaustive sweep of the home, not to re-examine the obvious, but to uncover what hadn't yet been noticed. The execution-style shootings had left little ambiguity about cause of death. Autopsies confirmed each victim was shot at close range, with minimal defensive wounds. That suggested trust or coercion. But if the motive ended with the killings, investigators needed evidence to prove premeditation. Why this timing? Why these victims? Answers weren't going to be found in surface observations. Forensic analysts began their systematic review in the common areas: living room, kitchen, hallway. They collected fibers, checked for trace residues, and dusted for latent prints. A black 9mm handgun, recovered from the scene, was confirmed as the murder weapon. Ballistics matched the rounds extracted during autopsy. The weapon's serial number traced back to a lawful purchase, not by McFadden, but by Holly, months earlier. The gun had not been reported stolen. It had been kept in the home, likely for protection, and ended up being used against them. This discovery added a disturbing element. The weapon was not brought in from outside. It was already there. The forensic team moved next to digital devices. 3 cell phones, Holly's, Tiffany's, and one belonging to a visiting teen, were recovered from various rooms. Jesse McFadden's phone was conspicuously absent. Holly's phone had its last outgoing message timestamped at 10:14 p.m., the night before the bodies were discovered. Nothing unusual was flagged in content: grocery lists, reminders. Tiffany's phone revealed text logs with 2 friends about staying over, plans that now would never happen. The significance lay in what wasn't there: no outgoing texts or calls from Jesse, no panic messages from the teens after 10:14 p.m. This raised questions about the timeline. The window between 10:14 p.m. and dawn, when police entered the house, was the period when the murders occurred. Investigators turned to network data, Router logs showed no activity after 10:19 p.m. that aligned too cleanly. Either the house went quiet naturally or someone disabled devices deliberately. Forensic examiners flagged that detail. One more detail complicated the picture. The home's exterior surveillance system had been deactivated. The DVR, found disconnected in a bedroom closet, had no recent footage. The system had been powered down at 9:48 p.m., according to the unit's internal clock. This was not an accidental failure. Someone had shut it off. Neighbors were re-interviewed. One reported seeing the porch light flicker off around the same time, shortly before 10. The timeline was tightening. Digital forensics layered with physical evidence built a picture of calculated control over the environment. Whoever executed these killings ensured no recordings, no alerts, no noise. The autopsy reports returned a second crucial piece of information. Toxicology screens were clean. No sedatives or alcohol in the victim's systems. This was not a crime facilitated by chemical restraint. The lack of defensive wounds on the children suggested either compliance under duress or a swift, coordinated attack before they understood the threat. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Miriam Long noted that the angle and proximity of the gunshot wounds suggested the victims were seated or standing calmly at the time of shooting. There was no struggle. They were taken by surprise. Digital footprints outside the home were sparse. Jesse McFadden's phone records, acquired through a warrant, revealed his device had pinged local towers until approximately 9:50 p.m. After that, silence. The phone had either been powered down or destroyed. Attempts to trace it through GPS failed. However, investigators obtained a secondary breakthrough through email metadata. An automated reminder for McFadden's upcoming court hearing on child pornography charges had been opened from a desktop at the residence at 6:43 p.m. the evening of the murders. It was the last known digital activity attributed directly to McFadden. These technical discoveries shifted the investigation's momentum. The lack of forced entry, the deactivated cameras, the targeted timing, it all pointed towards someone with full access and pre-existing control over the environment. The forensic evidence wasn't just confirming suspicions, it was narrowing the field. Detective Sarah Hunter reviewed the compiled reports that evening. The data aligned almost too cleanly. Router inactivity, disabled surveillance, no physical struggle. It was a closed system, contained and controlled. But she knew from experience that such neatness often masked a deeper level of planning. The absence of chaos didn't mean absence of intent. In fact, it often suggested the opposite. There was still no trace of Jesse McFadden. His bank accounts were untouched, his vehicle unaccounted for. Search teams expanded their radius, but no new leads emerged. The forensic investigation had illuminated the how, but not the why. The motive remained elusive. Without a clear trigger, the killings felt clinical, procedural, absent of the emotional chaos often found in family homicides. The deeper question remained, why strike now? Jesse McFadden had lived under legal scrutiny for years. His court date was approaching, but that alone didn't explain the sudden escalation to murder. The forensic picture, while thorough, lacked psychological context. And without McFadden's presence, there were no confessions, no justifications, only evidence. By the end of the third day, the investigation had established three key forensic pillars: the timeline of digital silence beginning at 10:19 p.m., the intentional disabling of surveillance systems, and the use of a weapon already inside the home. These facts tightened the circle around McFadden's likely involvement, but his motive and his location remained missing. Next, investigators would expand their scope beyond the home, tracking financial activity, interviews with past acquaintances, and any anomaly that could suggest where McFadden had gone, or whether he intended to resurface at all. By the fourth day, the investigation shifted from containment to expansion. The home had yielded every tangible forensic clue available: ballistics, autopsy results, router logs, disabled surveillance, all leading to the same conclusion. Yet Jesse McFadden remained missing. Without his capture, the case was incomplete. The procedural phase now demanded geographic reach, an organized manhunt. OSBI's command post began coordinating with local law enforcement agencies across eastern Oklahoma. McFadden's vehicle, a dark-colored pickup registered under his name, had not been located at the crime scene. It became the immediate focus of the search grid. License plate recognition systems, LPRs, in Henrietta and neighboring towns were queried for any recent hits. None returned positive after the night of the murders. That suggested one of two possibilities. McFadden had abandoned the vehicle outside the LPR range or switched to another means of transportation. The search grid was expanded to include state highways and rest areas within a 150-mile radius. Patrol units from the Oklahoma Highway Patrol were mobilized for coordinated sweeps. The FBI, already looped into the investigation given McFadden's parole status and prior federal charges, activated their Violent Crimes Task Force. Interstate travel checkpoints were quietly notified without triggering public alerts. McFadden's location was unknown, but the possibility of flight couldn't be dismissed. Meanwhile, investigators shifted focus to McFadden's financial activity. Access to his banking records and credit history revealed minimal recent activity, consistent with his limited employment history and parole restrictions. The last debit transaction occurred 4 days before the murders, a fuel purchase at a gas station on Highway 75 just outside Henrietta. No withdrawals, no credit card charges, no electronic activity since. Either McFadden had planned for this and stocked cash, or he was operating without funds, a risk that would surface if he remained at large long enough. Forensic accountants flagged a secondary anomaly. McFadden's bank account had received 3 small deposits from an unregistered prepaid card vendor over the previous month. Amounts were irregular: $200, $150, $80. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to suggest quiet financial maneuvering. The origin of those cards was traced to retail purchases in Muskogee, Oklahoma, a 45-minute drive from Henrietta. Surveillance footage from those retail locations was requested. Parallel to the financial tracing, digital forensic teams expanded the scope of device analysis. Though McFadden's primary cell phone had gone dark, prior location data was mapped across a 2-week span leading up to the murders. His movements were routine: home, local stores, brief trips to Muskogee. No apparent deviations, no outlier behavior. Yet in the digital age, data can linger elsewhere. Investigators issued warrants to social media platforms for any recent account activity linked to McFadden. A dormant Facebook profile under his legal name showed no posts since late 2022. However, an Instagram account under a pseudonym flagged activity. Direct messages sent 2 days prior to the murders. The messages were vague, conversational exchanges with an unknown female account. The recipient profile, traced through IP logs, linked back to a Tulsa-based user. When contacted, she denied any knowledge of McFadden, claiming she thought she was chatting with a different man entirely. The alias McFadden used online hadn't tied directly back to him until now, suggesting a deliberate effort to create false identities for communication. Back at the scene, investigators conducted secondary forensic sweeps, focusing on peripheral items: clothing fibers, soil samples from the backyard, tire tracks near the property's rear access point. A set of partial tire impressions, too faint for full comparison, suggested vehicle movement beyond the front driveway. Soil embedded in the tread marks indicated recent disturbance, but lab results weren't conclusive on timing. The tracks didn't match any vehicle known to be on the property prior. Detective Sarah Hunter reviewed the combined evidence grids. McFadden had either fled immediately following the killings or staged a misdirection to buy time. Without credit activity or surveillance hits, it pointed toward premeditated evasion. But to where, and with whose help? Interviews with acquaintances were expanded. A former cellmate of McFadden's residing in Tulsa admitted to receiving a cryptic text message a week before the murders. "If I go down, I won't go alone." The message had been deleted shortly after. The recipient had assumed it was McFadden's typical bravado. Now it felt like foreshadowing. The FBI analyzed communication patterns between McFadden and this former associate, but found no direct evidence of post-crime contact. Still, the timeline tightened. McFadden's digital, financial, and physical footprints ended precisely when the murders occurred. Search dogs were deployed to remote areas east of Henrietta, focusing on wooded patches near state parks and abandoned structures. They located a makeshift campsite approximately 20 miles from the crime scene: a small fire pit, remnants of food packaging, cigarette butts. Soil samples from the tire tracks at the McFadden property shared partial mineral composition with the ground at the campsite. Not conclusive, but enough to suggest a lead. Forensics extracted partial DNA from a cigarette filter at the site. Preliminary results indicated a male contributor. The sample was expedited for comparison against McFadden's known DNA profile. The result was pending, but the investigation narrowed to a tighter geographic area. The possibility that McFadden had retreated into rural Oklahoma's vast landscape became a working theory. By day's end, the investigation transitioned from evidence recovery to coordinated pursuit. Each forensic layer, vehicle, financial records, device data, environmental sampling, tightened the net but hadn't secured the subject. McFadden's absence persisted, but his options were shrinking. The DNA sample recovered from the cigarette filter at the campsite was a match. Jesse McFadden had been there, and not long before the discovery. This confirmation narrowed the manhunt zone, anchoring the fugitive's last known position within a 20-mile radius east of Henrietta. Still, despite the forensic victory, he remained one step ahead. It was a grim reminder that even with clean forensic alignment, physical capture often lagged behind. The OSBI coordinated with federal authorities to deploy aerial surveillance. Drones equipped with thermal imaging canvassed the wooded areas, while fixed-wing aircraft patrolled state routes extending from the suspected perimeter. The strategy was to pressure McFadden to disrupt any concealment pattern and to force movement, yet the thermal sweeps yielded no heat signatures matching a human target. Attention shifted to the highway network. Forensic mapping teams reanalyzed LPR data beyond the initial search grid, extending into rural corridors and feeder roads where surveillance coverage thinned. It was a tactical adjustment, anticipating McFadden's understanding of regional gaps in law enforcement infrastructure. One anomaly surfaced. An eastbound LPR hit logged by a private ranch gate camera near Lake Eufaula captured a vehicle matching McFadden's pickup description. The image, blurred and partially obstructed by a tree limb, offered just enough identifiable detail. The front grille pattern and partial license plate confirmed the connection. The timestamp aligned with the estimated 48-hour window after the murders, suggesting McFadden remained mobile longer than previously assumed. This discovery expanded the search toward the lake's surrounding areas. Lake Eufaula, covering over 100,000 acres with remote shorelines and isolated cabins, was an ideal location for someone seeking temporary refuge. Search teams, including Marine units, were deployed to inspect shoreline structures, boat ramps, and fishing access points. They cataloged abandoned vehicles, including an old sedan located in a secluded cove. Inside were discarded clothing items, food wrappers, and a prepaid phone box. The phone itself was missing, but investigators logged the box's serial number and tracked the retail purchase. Retail transaction logs confirmed the phone was bought at a Walmart in McAlester, Oklahoma, approximately 30 miles south of Lake Eufaula. Surveillance footage showed a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses consistent with McFadden's build, completing the purchase in cash, minimizing digital exposure. The timestamp placed him in McAlester nearly 2 days after the murders, pushing back assumptions that he was limited to local terrain. With this development, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a geographic profiling assessment. Given McFadden's limited financial resources, reliance on familiar terrain, and avoidance of urban centers, the analysis suggested he would oscillate between rural hiding spots and small towns with limited law enforcement presence. The focus shifted southward, toward counties bordering Texas, where surveillance coverage grew sparse. In tandem with the geographic expansion, digital forensics revisited the recovered devices from the McFadden home. Data extraction from Tiffany's cell phone yielded one overlooked item, a photo auto-synced to cloud storage from 2 weeks prior. The image showed a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, a reminder list including the phrase, "Court date May 1st. Though seemingly mundane, investigators traced the paper's backside through image enhancement. Faint impressions revealed what appeared to be an address in Atoka County, handwritten but never prominently displayed. Detectives followed up on the address. It led to a dilapidated storage unit facility registered under McFadden's former cellmate, the same individual who'd received the ominous pre-crime text message. Surveillance on the cellmate continued, but the unit itself became a point of interest. A search warrant was secured. The unit contained basic survival supplies: canned food, water, batteries, 2 prepaid SIM cards still in packaging, and printed maps of southeastern Oklahoma. No direct evidence of McFadden's recent presence surfaced, but the contents suggested contingency planning. One map featured annotations around rural crossing points into Texas, including unofficial trails and minor border crossings. The investigation's operational plan now included border collaboration. Texas authorities were briefed and checkpoints discreetly reinforced along non-commercial routes. The manhunt expanded into a 2-state operation. Despite the methodical layering of forensic data, DNA confirmation, LPR imagery, digital breadcrumbs, The absence of a direct sighting kept McFadden in flux. His profile didn't fit the typical fugitive burning through resources recklessly. Instead, he demonstrated an ability to anticipate surveillance blind spots and adapt accordingly. By the end of the fifth day, investigators had reshaped the search. The combination of forensic discoveries and behavioral analysis realigned the pursuit corridor from central Oklahoma into the rural southeastern stretch, extending toward Texas. McFadden's trail had narrowed, but his capture remained elusive. The sixth day of the investigation marked a turning point. Data compiled over the previous 5 days had produced a defined corridor stretching from Henrietta through Lake Eufaula down toward the Texas border. Despite aerial searches, thermal sweeps, and ground patrols, Jesse McFadden remained unaccounted for. Yet no fugitive can erase every trace. The investigative team turned back to digital channels, focusing on anomalies in the periphery. Devices not yet flagged, accounts not directly tied to McFadden, but operating within the same geographic radius. Analysts cross-referenced cell phone tower activity between Lake Eufaula and the Texas border. One prepaid device, purchased in McAllister, the same location as the burner phone box found earlier, showed limited activation. The phone connected briefly to a tower near Antlers, Oklahoma, approximately 50 miles south of McAllister, then went dark. The timing aligned with McFadden's last known movement. The device's IMEI was traced back to the same Walmart batch number as the previous prepaid phone, circumstantial but consistent. Law enforcement in Antlers was mobilized. Surveillance footage from gas stations and convenience stores along the primary roads was reviewed. At a local truck stop, grainy footage captured a man matching McFadden's build, purchasing canned goods and bottled water. He wore the same nondescript clothing as in the McAllister footage. His cap was pulled low. The timestamp was within 24 hours of the phone's brief connection. Simultaneously, financial analysts flagged a second prepaid card transaction in Antlers, this time at a hardware store. The purchase included a basic camping kit and a utility knife. No traceable identity, no surveillance showing a clear face, but the pattern of behavior confirmed the investigation's direction. McFadden was traveling south, methodically avoiding digital exposure, but relying on cash transactions to sustain movement. Forensic mapping redefined the target zone. Patrol units and drones refocused on the Kiamichi Mountains, a rugged stretch of terrain offering concealment. Wildlife cameras used by the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation were tapped into, scanning for outlier human activity. One unit captured a blurred image of a figure moving along an animal trail. Human posture, but no confirming details. The timestamp matched the gap following the antler sighting. With federal and state agencies converging, an operational grid was established. Roadblocks were deployed at critical junctures along Highway 271 and feeder routes leading into Texas. The FBI coordinated with the Texas Rangers to fortify minor border crossings. The goal was containment. By the end of the day, another anomaly surfaced. A search of the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, revealed an abandoned pickup matching McFadden's vehicle description, located in the woods near the Oklahoma-Texas border. The vehicle had been tagged by a park ranger, but no connection to McFadden had been made until now. Forensic teams dispatched to the site found the truck partially concealed beneath brush. Inside, the seats were stripped of fabric, floor mats removed. The glove compartment was empty. Forensics recovered one fingerprint smudge on the driver's side window, insufficient for a full match, but the positioning and partial ridge pattern suggested McFadden's hand. Soil samples matched those from the campsite found earlier. A trail of discarded items led investigators deeper into the woods. Footprints, wrappers, a makeshift lean-to shelter constructed from branches and tarps. DNA swabs from the shelter's interior were processed. While initial analysis was pending, physical proximity indicated McFadden had used the site as a temporary hold. With the noose tightening, the operational grid focused on isolating McFadden within the Kiamichi Mountain corridor. Each forensic lead had layered to produce not only a geographic map, but a behavioral profile, methodical, cautious, unwilling to engage. But patterns of movement, despite being calculated, are rarely indefinite. McFadden was running out of options, and terrain alone would not sustain him much longer. The seventh day of the investigation marked the most aggressive operational phase. With Jesse McFadden's vehicle recovered, his temporary shelter identified, and a defined area of movement centered within the Kiamichi Mountains, law enforcement transitioned from pursuit to containment. The FBI, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation (OSBI), and Texas Rangers coordinated to form a multi-agency task force, each agency contributing specialized units for tracking, perimeter control, and tactical engagement. The goal was precise: to close the net without further escalation. Tactical search teams deployed into the mountain corridor in quadrant formations, focusing on caves, old logging trails, and hunting cabins. Drones equipped with night vision and thermal imaging assisted in mapping possible escape routes. Environmental forensics, soil samples, broken branches, and recent fire pits helped trace incremental movements, tightening the manhunt radius. Digital forensics maintained pressure from another angle. Analysts rechecked tower pings and satellite telemetry for overlooked anomalies. They identified a faint but consistent pattern, a ping from an emergency SOS beacon activated within the past 24 hours. It wasn't registered to McFadden but originated within the search zone. The device, common among hikers, transmitted its coordinates intermittently. Tactical units were redirected to the signal's source. On approach, they found the beacon discarded, still transmitting. Its placement suggested deliberate misdirection. However, physical evidence at the site, a pair of worn boot prints leading away from the beacon, provided direction. The prints, matched to the same tread pattern found at the earlier lean-to shelter, confirmed McFadden's continued presence within the search area. Further environmental analysis narrowed the window of movement. Broken saplings, disturbed leaf litter, and human scat samples collected for DNA cross-referencing showed recent activity within a 3-mile radius. Bloodhounds trained on McFadden's scent were deployed to track his path, pushing the search deeper into a stretch of the mountains less accessible by vehicle. The operational strategy shifted to intercept mode. Roadblocks at key trailheads remained in place while aerial surveillance maintained thermal sweeps during nighttime hours. These sweeps identified a thermal anomaly near a creek bed, a heat signature consistent with human size, partially obscured by natural cover. Tactical units approached the area on foot, closing in with coordinated movements. At approximately 0400 hours, contact was established. McFadden's body was discovered beneath a rock outcrop, partially concealed by debris. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The firearm recovered at the scene matched the one used in the murders. Forensic analysis confirmed ballistic consistency, same make, same model, same serial number. No written note was recovered. However, the contents of McFadden's pockets included a prepaid phone, unused SIM cards, and a map marked with alternate trails leading toward the Texas border. His planning suggested intent to evade for longer but limited resources, and increased law enforcement pressure had likely cornered him. Autopsy results confirmed the time of death within 24 hours prior to discovery, coinciding with the timeline when the SOS beacon had been activated. McFadden's cause of death, a single contact gunshot wound to the temple, left no ambiguity. Toxicology screens showed no alcohol or drugs in his system. The act was deliberate, controlled, and final. With McFadden confirmed deceased, the investigation shifted focus to completing the forensic narrative. The murder weapon, ballistics, DNA matches at multiple sites, and the sequence of financial and digital breadcrumbs formed a cohesive case file. The investigative agencies prepared closure reports, documenting each phase from crime scene discovery to fugitive recovery. In the aftermath, law enforcement officials convened to review procedural failures. McFadden's release on parole, despite his violent history, the lack of immediate digital monitoring, and gaps in interstate coordination became focal points. Policy recommendations were drafted, including strengthened oversight of violent offenders with prior sexual assault convictions and expanded data sharing protocols between states. The families of the victims were briefed privately. The finality of McFadden's death left them without a trial, without a courtroom, but the forensic certainty of his actions and the accountability built through meticulous investigation offered them closure. With Jesse McFadden confirmed deceased and the forensic narrative complete, the investigation pivoted from field operations to internal review. The manhunt had ended, but the underlying mechanisms that allowed McFadden to re-enter society and ultimately commit multiple homicides remained under scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies, parole boards, and legislative bodies across Oklahoma began dissecting procedural gaps that enabled McFadden's release and unchecked freedom. The OSBI compiled a comprehensive timeline of McFadden's legal trajectory. His 2003 conviction for first-degree rape had resulted in a 20-year sentence. He served 17 years before qualifying for parole. During incarceration, McFadden was implicated in multiple disciplinary violations, including unauthorized communications with minors via contraband cell phones. Despite these red flags, no formal charges extended his sentence, and his parole board hearings reflected only his original conviction. Upon his release, McFadden's status as a registered sex offender required compliance with standard supervision protocols, residency checks, periodic in-person reporting, and restrictions on contact with minors. However, the system lacked digital monitoring infrastructure. McFadden was not equipped with a GPS ankle monitor, and his digital communications were not actively audited. These omissions allowed him to manipulate online platforms, communicate covertly, and rebuild a life without substantial oversight. Following the murders, Oklahoma's Department of Corrections initiated an internal audit. Preliminary findings revealed inconsistencies in parole supervision. Records indicated McFadden's assigned parole officer managed a caseload exceeding the state-recommended limit by 45%. This overload reduced the frequency of in-person visits and the depth of background checks into McFadden's daily activities. His home life, integrated with Holly McFadden and her children, had not been sufficiently evaluated against his parole restrictions regarding proximity to minors. Further analysis revealed gaps in interagency communication. The parole board and local law enforcement in Henrietta operated on separate databases. Updates regarding McFadden's pending court hearing for possession of child pornography were logged at the district court level, but not flagged within the parole system in real time. This failure delayed any potential enforcement of conditional restrictions or reevaluation of his risk profile. The case spurred immediate legislative proposals. Oklahoma's state Senate drafted provisions expanding mandatory electronic monitoring for violent sex offenders post-release. These measures required integration of GPS tracking with digital communication auditing, including flagged keywords and pattern recognition across online platforms. Additionally, the legislation mandated quarterly interagency reviews between parole officers, local law enforcement, and judicial entities to synchronize case files and risk assessments. At the federal level, the FBI submitted a parallel policy recommendation aimed at National Offender Registry enhancements. The proposal focused on creating dynamic risk profiles, factoring in not only past convictions but ongoing behavioral indicators, disciplinary records during incarceration, digital footprints, and social associations post-release. The goal was to move beyond static check-ins toward predictive monitoring capable of identifying escalations before they culminated in violence. The Department of Justice reviewed McFadden's parole case as a model for systemic failure analysis. A task force comprising criminal justice experts, behavioral analysts, and forensic auditors was formed to map potential fail points. Their findings reinforced the need for cross-jurisdictional data-sharing platforms, which could consolidate criminal, parole, and court records in real time. The task force identified similar cases across state lines, where offenders maintained compliance on paper but exploited blind spots between agencies. As these reforms took shape, survivor advocacy groups mobilized. Families of the victims, along with legal reform activists, pressed for the enactment of Knight's Law, named in memory of one of the young victims. The law would require that any registered sex offender facing new charges, particularly involving minors, be held without bail pending trial. This clause addressed the core issue in McFadden's case, where a known offender with pending child exploitation charges remained free until the day of the murders. Parallel to these legislative actions, forensic audit teams finalized their reports. Every phase of the investigation, from initial crime scene processing to fugitive tracking, was logged and assessed for procedural efficiency. The operational timeline became a case study in multi-agency collaboration under duress, identifying strengths in tactical response but weaknesses in preemptive oversight. In post-incident reviews, task force leaders acknowledged that while the field investigation proceeded with precision, the broader system failed at prevention. This distinction became the focal point of training modules developed for parole officers and local law enforcement, aimed at recognizing behavioral escalation patterns beyond formal violations. By the close of the 8th day, the McFadden case had transitioned from a singular criminal event to a catalyst for systemic change. The narrative extended beyond forensic evidence into the realm of policy reform. ensuring that the circumstances which enabled McFadden's actions would face structural correction. With Jesse McFadden deceased and policy reviews underway, the final phase of the investigation focused on formal closure. The OSBI and FBI consolidated all physical, digital, and forensic evidence into a comprehensive case file. Every phase, from the crime scene analysis, the layered manhunt, to the systemic audit, was documented, logged, and archived. The file was entered into the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, where details would serve future investigative reference. Autopsy records, ballistic matches, DNA confirmations, and digital trace logs left no ambiguity in the chain of events. The murder weapon's origin, use, and recovery, paired with McFadden's movements across Oklahoma, formed an uninterrupted timeline. There were no remaining questions of factual sequence. The Henrietta Police Department, OSBI, and FBI jointly issued a statement acknowledging procedural gaps and affirming their commitment to reform. Parallel to legislative measures, local agencies instituted mandatory case reviews for parolee supervision, integrating data-sharing protocols that aligned with broader federal guidelines. For the families of the victims, the lack of a courtroom trial left an undeniable void. Yet law enforcement's precise documentation offered clear accountability. Memorial services were held privately, while the community sought ways to rebuild. In the aftermath, national registries updated offender management systems, including real-time case alerts for individuals flagged as high risk. Jesse McFadden's case became a reference point in criminal justice seminars and parole training modules, emphasizing preemptive action and supervision. The investigation closed with all avenues exhausted, evidence secured, and systemic responses underway. The case served not just as a record of violent crime, but as a procedural blueprint for prevention. As I reflect on this case, one thing is clear: systems meant to protect us can fail, but awareness and accountability must never waver. Stories like this remind us that vigilance isn't just the responsibility of law enforcement. It belongs to all of us. We owe it to victims and survivors to demand better, to ask hard questions, and to ensure the warning signs are never ignored again. How do you feel about the balance between second chances and public safety? Should policies be stricter, or is there room for rehabilitation? If this story resonated with you or challenged your views, leave a comment below and share where you're watching from. And if you found this video valuable, subscribe to the channel for more real-life cases that matter. Your voice helps these stories be heard.